morning, everyone. Welcome to this morning's program, another in the series of winter horticulture talks with the Camden Garden Club and hosted online by the Camden Public Library. Today, I would first like to say that this will be recorded and posted on the Camden Public Library and Camden Garden Club YouTube channels. And I invite you to type in the chat any questions that you have, and I will read them out at the end of the presentation. And I would like to welcome Lucy Ebert. She is the president of the Camden Garden Club, and she's going to tell you a little bit about the organization and introduce today's speaker. All right, Lucy, over to you. Oh, I think you're muted, Lucy. One moment, everyone. One moment. Okay, there you are.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
Good morning, everyone. Our speaker this morning is Gary Fish, who is the Maine State horticulturalist since 2015. His topic is yardscaping, which is defined as a way to create and maintain healthy landscapes through ecologically based practices that minimize the reliance of water, fertilizer, and pesticides. All of us are very anxious to hear his ideas. So Gary, please take it away.
All right. Well, thank you, Lucy. Hopefully everybody can see me now. So
Yes.
I appreciate the invitation to speak today on yardscaping. It's something that I helped to start back in 1999 when I was working with the Friends of Casco Bay, and they wanted to do something that was a sustainable landscaping effort, and started out with something called bayscaping, and then the Maine Board of Pesticides Control, where I worked at the time, wanted to make it a statewide effort, and we coined the term and started what we called the Yardscaping Partnership. And I will talk about that today. Let me share my screen. Hopefully that's coming through okay now.
Yep.
Great. So as it says here, yardscaping was basically designed to create a more healthy landscape environment. And I will go through a number of different parts here, starting out with about yardscaping in general, and then moving on to a little bit about pollinators and a little bit about how to landscape to improve our habitats for birds. And that will be kind of my ending. So looking at yardscaping in general, the mission was to inspire Maine people to create and maintain healthy landscapes through practices that minimize reliance on water, fertilizer, and pesticides. And we do still have a yardscaping website that needs to be updated a bit. The Yardscaping Partnership was a little bit weary for a few years under a different administration, and now it's coming back. And we do have kind of the tenets of yardscaping, and I'll talk about all of these. I'm not going to go through them right now. And they are very similar to what Doug Tallamy has been talking about in the last 5 years or so, maybe a little bit longer than that. Doug is a professor at the University of Delaware and has been doing a lot of work on trying to figure out what we need for plants in our landscapes to promote better habitat, especially for birds, but also for pollinators now. And a lot of the same bullets that he has are the ones that we had put into yardscaping back in the over 20 years ago. And it is important that, restoring little things actually do run the world. They do matter. The ecosystem that we rely on is very fragile, and it starts from the base. And what we have done over many years is develop landscapes that don't really support that ecosystem all that well. And with a few minor changes, we can help to restore that ecosystem. One of the things that yardscaping was first started out for was to protect waterways, especially when we worked with the Friends of Casco Bay and also what's called Maine lakes now, and the many different groups that are out there trying to reduce water contamination. And one of the things that's really important with landscapes, if you're on the water, I have a camp on Flying Pond in Mount Vernon, is to make sure that you try to preserve the existing landscape that's next to the water. If you're going to put paths down to the water, don't make them straight down so that they erode and go directly into the water. Don't mow your lawn right up to the edge of the water. Try to leave at least a minimum of a 10-foot buffer, if not maybe a 25 buffer. And then one of the things that we've been doing for many years, which is a kind of a bad habit, is raking everything up all the time. And it's that duff or those leaves and those needles and all that detritus that serves as a filter that helps to slow the water down and filter out the pollutants that may be in the water. So try to leave that behind, especially next to the water. And we need to think about the plants that we're using. Native plants can be well adapted in some instances. In other instances, they can be problematic. Something like viburnums have had problems in the past with the viburnum leaf beetle. But there are many native plants that we can use that will provide the real habitat that our native wildlife have grown to love and have evolved with. And we also want to get away from the invasive plants that have been used for many years. And one of the things that the Animal and Plant Health Division, the plant health programs that I am the supervisor of, does is look at ways of prohibiting truly invasive plants. So there are 33 plants that have already been banned since 2018. You can see those here. They are some of the more common ones that people would know would be something like Norway maple, which is also called Crimson King maple, or burning bush, or barberry, or honeysuckle, or something like the bittersweet. Those are all plants that have been banned since 2018. There's a new set of plants that we just passed a new rule on, because we look at this rule every 5 years, and we added 30 new plants to this list. Some of the ones that you might know would be something like Russian olive, or winter creeper euonymus, or the ground ivy. There's a variegated version of ground ivy that people plant. Something like the Callery pear or Bradford pear, colt's foot. These are all plants that starting January 1st of 2024 will be banned at that time. And they're definitely very invasive, especially south of us, and some of them are already invasive in Maine. And then we do have one that's in a special category, which is Rugosa rose. I know it's a beloved plant for a lot of people. It did not end up being banned this time around. It is in a special category of its own, whereas when they sell it after January 1st, 2024, they have to have either tags on the plants or signs where they're selling them, warning people about its potential to be very invasive on the coast. And what happens is those rose hips that fall into the water float out to uninhabited islands and other places where we have sand dunes that then start up populations of this plant, which is not native to the state of Maine, and it becomes invasive in those situations. Where it will still be able to be planted is inland. It is often used in parking lots and other places where you need a plant that is resistant to salt. Another part of yardscaping is to reduce your lawn area. Lawns can be important in some ways. You know, we need places to play. We need to have fire breaks around our houses. They do provide some habitat for certain types of organisms, but ideally they don't provide as much habitat as either a wildflower field or just additional landscaping with trees and shrubs and perennials and other plants. And the other part of the problem with lawns is that they are a driver of a lot of water use. They require a lot of maintenance. So there's cost there in terms of maintenance, as well as cost to the environment, where our lawnmowers don't have catalytic converters. So they're spitting out a lot more pollution than our cars do. On average, this little lawnmower puts out about the same exhaust as 11 small cars. A riding lawnmower, 1 hour on it is about driving 400 miles in a car. And I think that, why do we want big lawns? They take up a lot of time. They give us kind of an open view, but at the same time, they take up a lot of our time that we could be doing something a lot more fun than riding a lawnmower. And this is the just for fun kind of lawnmower that might work out to reduce the pollution. So there's different ways to minimize the lawn. Instead of having a big old lawn like this, you can put in winding paths and have different shrub and tree beds, different layers, or you can just stop mowing. And a lot of people do that now in no mow May. I've done that for a couple of years, and depending upon how much weed control there's been in your lawn to begin with, you may or may not get a lot of habitat there if you just stop mowing. But you can stop mowing and let the meadow come up. And if you don't get a lot of productive plants in there, then you can add to those over time and just keep adding year after year until you have a really great habitat for pollinators and birds and mammals and others. If you do decide to go with some sort of a meadow, which I did years ago, I lived in Maine, and we had a house that when I bought it had 3 acres of area that was all mowed by the previous owner. So it was all this big, gigantic lawn. I stopped mowing it right away and allowed pretty much 2/3, if not more of it, to come up. And then it was only mowed every one or 2 years, usually 2, sometimes 3. And ideally, to be able to get the flowering like this, you need to go with at least a 2-year cycle, but a 3-year cycle would be even better. It allows those biennial plants to go through a full life cycle. You get a lot more seeding in over time. So that's just something to consider. Just stopping mowing can create a lot of habitat. Again, we want people to be reducing runoff. A couple of different ways it can be done. If you do have hard surfaces, if you can go with porous pavement or pavers or some other sort of material in your yard, that's going to help to allow water to penetrate instead of running off and then creating the potential for erosion and bringing in any type of pesticides or fertilizers or something like that into the waterway. The other thing you can do is you can create rain gardens like this, where if you've got a natural swale or if you've got a place where you can put in certain types of soil materials and then plants that can handle being wet and then dry, then you can create something like a rain garden and divert your runoff water to that. Or you can put in rain barrels like this and collect your rainwater and then use it slowly on your landscape. But otherwise, if you can just direct water to vegetated areas, that's going to be helpful rather than having it develop a little bit more flow and runoff, which then brings with it all types of potential sediments that go into either directly into a waterway or into a ditch or into a drainage, and then eventually it gets to our waterways. One other part of yardscaping is to reduce reliance on pesticides, fertilizers, and water. A couple of different things you can do is you can grow plants that are resistant to insects and diseases. So some of our native plants are going to be that way. Some of our non-native plants are going to be that way. It really depends upon, what your goal is and what you're putting into your landscape. You can also put in plants that tolerate really low fertility. Here you can see sweet fern. That is one that is really, really able to grow with little or no extra fertility. Also drought tolerant. So if we look at our plants that we're putting in, we can choose them wisely and put in plants that don't demand a lot of inputs. You can do the same thing with your lawn. Instead of putting in the typical Kentucky bluegrass lawn, which I call the heroin addict of grasses, it requires a lot of extra fertilization and it tends to have more insect and disease problems than something like fine fescue or a tall fescue, if you can convert your lawn slowly but surely to these varieties of or species of grasses, then that lawn area can become less intensive, require less watering, hold up to more drought, be able to resist insects and diseases more. So that's something to consider. And then we need to look at, even with our native plants, something like cherries that are flowering, they have just a ton of different insect and disease problems, as opposed to something like a pagoda dogwood, which really doesn't have a whole lot of problems. And they both provide beautiful white flowers in the spring, so they are a good substitute for each other. Same thing goes with something like paper birch is not a really good choice for a tree to put out as a specimen. It likes to have a lot of other friends around. It's a pioneer species. And when you put it out in your front yard all alone, it doesn't do well. One that would do better is something called a river birch, which eventually will probably be a native plant in the state of Maine as we have climate change. Right now, it's really native to a little bit further south in New York and Ohio in that area. As far as creating better habitats and to reduce the impingement of rainwater, we need to have diverse landscapes. We don't want to go to monocultures. We want to try to spread out the different species that we have and then incorporate them in different layers with trees and shrubs and ground covers and perennials and lawns and all of that, so that that diversity leads to a better wildlife habitat. And it also, if you do start to have a pest problem, it's not as noticeable because it's not hitting a ton of plants in your landscape. And as I mentioned as well, planting in layers is important. Again, that helps to reduce the runoff. It helps to stop soil erosion. It provides different habitats for different organisms. And underneath the trees where you've got shrubs and then ground covers, it provides great landing places for many of the beneficial insects and other things that need to have that duff layer to either overwinter as a pupa or something like that. So creating wildlife habitats is diversity, planting in layers, thinking about nectar and fruit producing plants. Continuous blooms are really important for many different types of wildlife, but especially for the pollinators. And then you may need to add water, woody debris, feeders, things like that that can help out depending upon the wildlife that you're looking to attract. One of the things that has been going on with Doug Tallamy and the folks that have been researching with him is looking at which plants produce the most soft-bodied insects and especially caterpillars. And he's put together these keystone plant lists. And this one happens to be for not our ecoregion, but it also, for the most part, is good for our ecoregion. And at the very top, you see oaks. Oaks produce a lot of caterpillars. Then you've got cherries and plums. Then you've got birches. Then you've got cottonwoods, which maybe would be aspens here. You've got maples and box elder, crab apples, and so on. You even have pines in here like pitch pine on the coast and eastern white pine throughout the state. Then when you get down into shrubs, things like blueberries are going to be really great to produce a lot of caterpillars. They're also great for pollinators. And then willows like the pussy willow or black willow, very good. And then when we get into perennials, number one here is solidago. So that is goldenrod. And a lot of people are afraid of goldenrod and think it's going to cause some sort of hay fever or something like that, but it doesn't, because it is insect pollinated. And plants that are insect pollinated have sticky, heavy pollen that doesn't float around in the air and get into our noses and cause us to have allergic reactions. And the reason why these goldenrods are so important is that they are really late flowers and they provide the really important food at the very end of the season for our bees and other pollinators. Asters are in that same category. So we should be adding a lot of asters. And what's unfortunate is that these goldenrods and asters have been considered weeds in the past, and we've eliminated them from our landscapes. And that's one of the reasons why we see this great reduction in the amount of insects that are out there. the insect apocalypse, which a lot of people are trying to blame on pesticides. I don't agree with that. I think that it's really mostly about the lack of habitat and the way that we've changed our landscapes and taken away habitat, as well as the way that we have lights on all the time at night. I'll talk more about that in a second. And then the sunflower family, the Helianthus genus, is also a very important one. One of the things that's really important, and I'll talk more about this later, is choosing the right plants to plant in the right place, and making sure that when we go to the garden center that we've done our homework, that we have a plan, that we know what kind of sunlight exposure we have where we want to plant plants, whether it's wet or dry, what kind of habitat is there, so that we can match up those plants to those habitats, instead of just buying everything that's pretty and bringing it back and then trying to find a place to put it. And if it doesn't fit in, then it struggles. It becomes a target for insects and diseases, and we want to avoid that. And the other thing is if we can minimize the disturbance in the existing landscape by stopping mowing, or if we're building a new house, preserving some areas where there are trees and shrubs. The extreme example I have here is this wild cranberry bog that was next to a home where one of my friends lived, and they bought it from out of state, and they built a house there, and they filled it over and turned it into a lawn. And that's kind of anti-yardscaping, where you're converting something that was great habitat into something that isn't such great habitat. And just some other, ideas in terms of right plant and right place. If you've got a dry, sunny site, you got to put the right plant there, or a wet, shady site, whatever it may be. Another tenet of yardscaping is to use common sense pest management, and I like to call this integrated pest management. One of the programs that I supervise is the integrated pest management program, and we have an integrated pest management council, and our integrated pest management specialist is Hillary Peterson. And when it comes to IPM, is what we call it, you need to know your pests. You need to do whatever you can to manage it, and in multiple different ways. You need to know when you've got something that is a beneficial. And I show that here with this Japanese beetle. You can see the little white dots on its back. Those are winsome fly eggs. So those are beneficial flies that are going to kill this Japanese beetle. And if you're out there picking Japanese beetles by hand, you want to always leave these ones behind. You never want to pick one that has a little white dot on its back, because that's one that's going to die, and you want to allow those winsome flies to populate. Mowing and pruning and watering, really important, and doing it properly, and then using pesticides as a last resort. I think that one of the things that we do not very well in our landscapes quite often is watering, especially on lawns, but even with other plants as well. Ideally, with any plant, you want to water deeply and infrequently. If you water every single day, that's like babying the plant too much. It's like babying your children too much. They get weak. So you want to make sure that you don't water much more than once or twice a week at the most, and to always water early in the morning, so that by the time night comes and the dew settles, that plant has dried out some, because otherwise it creates the perfect environment for fungal diseases. And on turf, grasses are programmed to go dormant in the summer. And if we just allow them to go dormant and stay off them, don't continue to mow, don't have a big party on them, your lawn can do just fine, and it will come back in the spring and be just as healthy as it was to begin with. So just keep that in mind as well. Then integrated pest management is also a number of steps that are really important. First and foremost is to know your pest. You've got to identify your pest in order to know how to manage it properly. And in some instances, you can control it mechanically. You can mow it, you can pull it, you can pick it by hand. And then sometimes irrigation takes care of a pest, or fertilization takes care of a pest. There are many fungal diseases that are there because the plant doesn't have enough nitrogen or doesn't have enough phosphorus or potassium. So we can manage things that way, as opposed to trying to apply something to control it. So pest identification is crucial. I use this example of grubs. So these are the rear ends of grubs, the business end of grubs. And the only way to tell the difference between them, besides size to some degree, is to look at the hair patterns on their rear ends. They're called the rastral patterns. And they all have a very characteristic pattern. Right now, the majority of grubs that we have in lawns are probably European chafers. Used to be Japanese beetles, but now it's probably European chafers. And there's a big difference between how you manage them. European chafers need to be managed in a way that is at least 2 weeks earlier than Japanese beetles, if you're really going to try to control them with something that's like a biological nematode, or even with certain insecticides. You've got to get the timing right, or else it's not going to be effective. And the last thing you want to do is apply something that isn't effective. So we can encourage biological controls, as I mentioned already, with the winsome fly on the Japanese beetle, but there are also nematodes like these that can be used to control grubs or other pest insects. And then we use pesticides as a last resort. And basically, if we do, then we need to read and follow the label directions very carefully. Pesticides are out there for our use, but they are labeled very specifically so that we reduce the risks. And if we don't follow the label, we're violating federal law, if you read it very carefully. And we're also taking bigger risks than we should be with those pesticides. So, and a pesticide is insecticides, fungicides, rodenticides, herbicides are pesticides. There's a lot of misunderstandings of those terms. Even disinfectants are pesticides. So are the insect repellents that we put on our skin. They're all considered pesticides. And I think it's really important to realize that natural or organic doesn't mean safe. There are many organic approved insecticides and fungicides that are highly toxic to pollinators, to other insects, to beneficials, and even to ourselves. It used to be a few years back that a lot of people used rotenone as the insecticide of choice for organic situations. Well, rotenone is highly toxic to humans. It only came in a 5% dust for the most part. And it's not on the market anymore because the manufacturer took it off the market because there were a number of studies that showed that it was potentially connected to Parkinson's disease. So just because something is natural doesn't mean that it's safe. It doesn't really mean anything. The term natural means very little to me. You know, botulism is natural, arsenic is natural, these copper sulfate is natural, which is highly toxic to all kinds of things. So just keep that in mind. Don't think that if you turn to something that's organic, that's going to be 100% safe. So just some quick IPM principles that basically no single pest control method is going to be successful. You have to really be looking all the time and monitoring to know whether or not a pest is being managed or not. And just because there is one species there, one individual, doesn't mean that it's a problem. Really, there are certain thresholds that you need to reach before you start trying to manage the population. And then I also like to just remind folks that IPM is all of these things combined. It's not a biological control program. It's not organic. Organic is part of integrated pest management. It's not a pesticide-free program. Pesticides are part of integrated pest management and many different types of pesticides. And sometimes it can be expensive and sometimes it's the least expensive. It really depends upon the pest. Earlier, I mentioned that lights can be a huge problem, and this is something that we hope that eventually we can find better ways of using lights at night for safety and not killing off a ton of insects. Here you see brown-tail moth males on the side of a building, and you might think, well, that's good. You could trap them that way, but I don't recommend that at all. It's kind of like Japanese beetle traps. If you use traps of certain types, they actually just attract a lot more of those insects to your yard and create a bigger problem, cause more damage. And I put in lights, and Doug Tallamy talks a lot about this as well, because to me, that's probably one of the bigger parts of the insect apocalypse, is that we have so many lights on, They attract so many insects, which then are exhausted because they are homing to the light and they don't know what to do, and they end up exhausting themselves and dying. There is some research going on at the University of Maine that hopefully will be fruitful, will show that different kinds of lights may actually not be as detrimental to the insects. They may not be as attractive to insects. And hopefully over time, we can maybe convert those light situations to something else, but at least have them on motion sensors so that they only come on when they're absolutely needed. So I want to just talk a little bit first about pollinators and then a little bit about birds, and starting out with bees and pollinators. And there are many different types out there. And to be bee friendly, we need to have shelter. We need to have a diversity of plants, lots of blooms. We need some water. And something that a lot of us don't have in our landscapes is some bare soil. And if you look at bees, most of our bees are not the ones that we typically think of as bees. So our bumblebees and honeybees are the social bees. That's only about 10% of bee species in the United States. 90% of bees in the United States are solitary. So you have a single queen that is laying eggs and provisioning a nest, and she does it all by herself. She doesn't have any other workers or drones or other helpers. There's no big social caste there. And generally, they're looking for nectar and sugar, amino acids, and then they're looking for pollen. And they need the pollen in order to have the protein and to grow their young, just like I'll talk about with birds. And most of them gather nectar from lots of different flower species. And it really depends upon how long their tongue is, to which flowers they can get that nectar from. And then when it comes to pollen, they can be a lot more selective. There are certain bees that only go to single plants, or certain butterflies that only go to one plant. And it's important that we understand that and provide that kind of habitat when it's needed. If we look at how bees see things, they see their colors different from us. Oftentimes it's kind of designed so that they can see their landing pad. So they see a different color in the center of the flower, and that tells them where those anthers and stamens and pistils are, so that they can get in and get the pollen off from those anthers. And it really depends upon the organism as to what kind of plant they're looking for, the flower, whether it's symmetrical or not symmetrical. And some of them are looking for kind of a complex situation. Bumblebees love blueberry flowers because they know how to get the pollen out. They can basically detach their wings, and then they buzz pollinate. So they shake their wings at a certain frequency that allows that pollen to drop out of the blueberry plant. And it's pretty neat how that's done. Whereas a honeybee can't do that, and they get frustrated, and they'll actually even eat a hole at the end of the flower to go in to try to get their reward. And then when it comes to, what kinds of colors that attract different groups of pollinators, bees like blue, purple, white, and yellow, and this is just very general. Butterflies like orange, pink, and red. Beetles like the big fleshy disc-shaped smelly white and green flowers, sometimes really smelly, as well as some of the flies. And then wasps and flies like yellow, pink, and white. So that would be your flower flies. And we need to provide nesting habitats. And for most of our bees, that means ground nesting. So we need friable soil. We need a place where they can make their nest underground. And some of them are making little tiny nests, and others are making bigger nests like the bumblebees or maybe the yellow jackets. And then we do have stem nesters that are looking for hollow stems. And then finally, we have the big cavity nesters like the bumblebees and the honeybees that are social, so they need a bigger area. One of the things that most of us don't have in our yard are these bare soil areas, and these are really important for those ground nesting bees. And it needs to be kind of a sparsely vegetated area with well-drained soil, full sun. It can't be an area that's going to get waterlogged, because then those underground bees end up drowning. It can be flat or banked. If you think about a typical swallow bank or something like that, that's a great place for these bees to nest as well. You've got kind of sandy, well-drained soil. Then you have your cavity nesters that can also be underground, and you can actually purchase these bumblebee nests, and I'll show one later. Or you can have rotten logs. So one of the things you might want to add to your landscape is a hollow log. Have it off to the side somewhere, and that can be habitat for different types of pollinators, including possibly something like feral honeybees or your bumblebees. So they like those dead trees, the snags, the fallen logs, and they also go to old rodent nests. So maybe a lot of us don't like our chipmunks, but those chipmunks are great, making the perfect nests for a number of our bee species, and including bumblebees, as well as ones that we might not like quite so much, the yellow jackets, but those are important as well. The other thing that we don't do is provide these hollow stems. So we need to look at the different types of plants that can provide them, many different types of plants. One of the ones that I have in my landscape are the sedums and elderberry. Also, I have a number of other sunflowers, and they provide this perfect nesting habitat for these nesters that like the hollow stems. And Heather Holm at the University of Minnesota has come up with a great way of kind of creating habitat for stem nesting bees. You start out now in the winter, you just leave all of those hollow stem plants the way that they are, leave those seed heads, allow those to be there for the birds that need to come in for winter food. And then in the spring, you cut back those stems to 8 to 24 inches. Variable heights is good because different bees like different stem lengths. And then they can, basically provision their nest with an egg and a pollen ball. Through the summer, you get the new growth, which kind of covers up those old stems, so you don't necessarily notice them quite as much as you might have if you didn't have that regrowth. And through the fall and the winter, again, you let those plants stand. You leave them there as they dry, as the seeds are let go. And then in the spring, you come back and again, you cut them at different lengths. Leave the old ones because they're probably still going to be good for at least another year or maybe two, and just keep going through this process, and you will create that perfect habitat for those stem nesters. You can also do it in kind of an artificial way. You can create stem nesting habitat with blocks of wood with variable size holes, diameters there. You can do it with straws, or you can do it with cutting up those hollow stems and putting them somewhere where the bees can access them. This way, I don't think is quite as good as the other way, because you're concentrating these bees all together where they might spread diseases to each other. And then this is an example of a bumblebee nest that can be put in the ground, and the perfect habitat for a bumblebee queen to start her nest. Another thing to keep in mind is that you need to provide water. And what I do in my landscape is I have a pie plate with marbles in it. So it has shallow water with a place for the bees to kind of stand and be able to take a drink. You don't want to have really deep water there. And it's important, again, to just as a reminder, to have a diversity of flowers and overlapping blooms. Make sure you provide that shelter or those nesting habitats. And then also the invasive plants aren't helping our pollinators all that much. Switching gears a little bit, now talking about birds and baby birds, and this is where Doug Tallamy's research has come in. It's really important that our baby birds, they need a lot of protein, and they get that from soft-bodied insects. And here you can see, these are all pictures from my meadow that I had at my house in Wayne, where you can see a diversity of soft-bodied insects there that the birds can feed to their chicks. And the reason why it's so important is that they need these soft insects that they can shove down their gullets. They can be large, so there's a good protein amount there. They're very nutritious. These soft-bodied insects don't have a lot of chitin, so they don't have the rough edges to them. And they have lots of carotenoids, which are really important to birds, that they don't really get that from other plants because they don't eat vegetation, they eat seeds and insects and things like that. Just looking at a few plants that I have in my landscape and some that I don't, and just a couple of examples. So something like coneflower, it's great for partial sun and it'll do well in different types of soil. It's pretty easy to grow. It's great for all kinds of bees and all kinds of different soft-bodied insects. So it's going to be good for both pollinators as well as for birds. Joe pieweed, another one, really great. I have it in my landscape. It's great for a number of different pollinators as well as something like this tiger moth. And it's, again, going to benefit both the bees and the birds. This is one that could be in a wetter or moister area. Where I live in Augusta now, it's very clay soil, very waterlogged at times. So this does really well there. And it's great for all kinds of pollinators as well as a number of birds that would feed off the insects that are being produced by this particular plant. Here's another one that I have in my kind of wet yard, swamp milkweed, beautiful flowers, great habitat for all kinds of pollinators. Of course, it's going to be a host plant for the monarch butterfly as well as some other butterflies. And it's going to provide great habitat as well for different types of birds because it does produce some other insects. These happen to produce a fair amount of soft-bodied aphids as well. Another one that can do really well in both gravelly, kind of drought-tolerant areas is cardinal flower. It can also do well right next to wet or moist sites. It's one that's difficult to grow. It'll grow really well for a couple of years and then go away and then it'll kind of pop up somewhere else. But it's a great plant because it's good for hummingbirds. It's good for those butterflies with really long tongues. It's also great as far as producing, again, soft-bodied insects for a number of birds. I mentioned this earlier, the New England aster. The asters are really, really important plants for our pollinators, our bees, especially the ones that are out really late in the season. Here you can see a hoverfly. So there's a number of flies that mimic bees that are also pollinators. It brings in lots of bumblebees. This past year, mine was just mobbed with bees, even in November, because we had that really warm spell, even really late in the season. So it's really important because those late food resources are going to help those insects make it through the winter. For variability, you could also use something that's grass-like the Pennsylvania sedge. It's really good in kind of dappled sun where there's good drainage. It provides grain, actually, for things like turkeys and grouse and whatnot. And it also provides good habitat for skippers and other different types of soft-bodied caterpillars that are going to be good for your other birds. Then something like the false sunflower, I have these in my landscape, again, really mobbed with lots of pollinators. I do get this silvery checker spot quite a bit, and it's going to provide good habitat for soft-bodied insects as well. Phlox is really great as far as you can have your ground cover phlox, which is your native phlox, really, really important plant to have out there. And then this is not a native one. And actually the snowberry clearwing moth is not native to Maine as well. And this is one that, there are some plants out there that aren't native that are still good for pollinators. And, there are some phloxes that are actually quite good. Another grass type species would be little blue stem. It doesn't do quite as well this far north, but on the coast, it'll do fine, especially in the Camden area where you have really good growing conditions like we actually do here in Augusta. And it's one that can provide some fall color as well. And it's really good for a number of different soft-bodied caterpillars. So it's great for the birds and it provides a different kind of habitat. One that I have on the lakeshore at my camp on Flying Pond is black huckleberry, very similar to the blueberry in terms of the bumblebees love to buzz pollinate it. but it produces these big caterpillars, which are really great for a number of birds. Feed those baby birds. One that can give you some really neat fall color and would be fine in your area is the northern spice bush. It also provides a nice berry for birds in the fall, and it has beautiful, yellow flowers for all kinds of different butterflies, and it also produces the spice bush swallowtail butterfly, which has the really cool caterpillar with the funny fake eyes. So just a reminder of those keystone plants. Again, oaks, if we can keep oaks in our landscape, that's great. I know where a lot of you may be in the Camden area where there's been a lot of brown-tail moth. We've kind of looked at some of the oaks as being a deterrent or a problem because they host a lot of those caterpillars. Unfortunately, those caterpillars are not very good for birds. They're too hairy. They don't use those caterpillars and they cause all kinds of itches for us. I don't think they necessarily do it for birds. And then, of course, the maples. The maples are really important because they're some of the earliest flowers of the year. Red maples and silver maples, very early flowering, really important for those first bees waking up in the spring. And then if you've got kind of a shady area, you could put in a striped maple, which also has a flower that's pollinated. But maples are also versatile. Red maples can be in both wet as well as dry sites. Silver maples, same thing. Sugar maples like a drier site. Again, really important keystone plant is goldenrod, and I've added a ton of goldenrod to my landscape. I recommend that everybody do that. That really is providing both a lot of habitat for a number of different caterpillar species, and then a wide variety of pollinators, even including the yellow jacket, which some of us don't necessarily like, but they are actually good pollinators. Wanted to talk about some resources that are out there to help you plan and bring plants into your landscape that are going to be beneficial to wildlife, to birds, to pollinators, to all types of mammals and so on. And one of the sites that's really good is this Audubon site. It allows you to go in and look at the plants, see, how big they get, what kind of soils they're going to do well in, and then they can tell you what they might attract in terms of both birds and pollinators. And I highly recommend this site. It's not my overall favorite, but it is a great site. It's one that I use in conjunction with some others. Then the National Wildlife Federation has this site, which was put together with Doug Tallamy, looking at those very key plants. And so they give you a way of looking at plants that are native in your area, as well as finding ones that are good for pollinators. You can develop a list so that you can do your planning for your garden for each season. And it's a pretty good site as well. But my favorite by far is the Native Plant Trust Plant Finder, Garden Plant Finder. It is very versatile, and I'll show you a little bit more of this. This used to be the New England Wildflower Society, and now they're called the Native Plant Trust. This resource is really great. It starts out with these ecoregions, which I mentioned earlier. So we're in the kind of level 3 ecoregions of the Acadian plains and hills, where most of you are. The northeastern coastal zone is the blue here, and the northeastern highlands is further west and north. And the reason for these is that when we look at trying to decide if a plant or a insect or something is native, it has to have been in these regions and evolved in these regions pre-colonial. And these help us to figure out which plants to plant, which are truly native to our area. And what this site can do, you can start out by, you can choose the type of plant that you're looking for, a tree, a shrub, a perennial. If it's flowering, what color flowers, how tall it's going to get, how big it's going to spread, really important information. And then all of these different variables that help you to have better success with your plants in the long term. So first you can look at, do you want a straight species that is open pollinated, that has the most genetic diversity? Do you want a selection, which again is probably a native, but it has a very specific flower color or size or something like that? Or is it a cultivar which has been made from tissue culture? It's not grown from seed. So with a cultivar, they're all genetically identical. All of these can be good. They can all be good as native plants in your landscape. And the recommendation from Doug Tallamy is to go with 70% native plants at least, and 30% not native plants and no invasive plants. And then you can look at, is it sun, shade, part shade? Is it dry or wet? You can choose your ecoregion. Do you want a summer or fall bloom? Because again, you want to have those continuous blooms, so you want some of all of them. Does it attract wildlife? Is it a pollinator powerhouse plant? And I'll talk more about those. Is it a host plant for certain butterflies or something like that? Does it tolerate deer or rabbits? Nothing is deer proof or rabbit proof. Is it drought or salt tolerant? Are you in an urban area? Is it compaction tolerant? Is it a ground cover? Is it a hedge? Does it naturalize? All of these different variables. Is it low maintenance? Is it fragrant? Does it have a fruit? All these things can help us to do a better job of choosing plants. And then the last thing it gives you a choice of is it compact or clumping? Is it spreading or suckering? And then do you want to know all the plants that have all the characteristics that you checked? Or do you want to see all the plants that have any of those? Usually I don't check that because you get way too big of a list. And just to go back to the pollinator powerhouse ones, those are ones that if they're woody, they support 75 or more lepidopterans. So those would be caterpillars. Or if they're herbaceous, they support 15 or more species of caterpillars. And I did a couple of searches for pollinator powerhouse plants. These were some of the woody ones that came up. In my landscape, I've got the pussy willow, I've got the pagoda dogwood, I've got the steeple bush, but all of these are good choices. And then looking at perennials, here, I've got some sunflowers in my landscape, as well as a couple of different goldenrods. Here you can see the native lupin. Most of the lupins that you see out on the roadside are not native. They come from the Northwest and are actually sort of an invasive plant that we'd rather that people not continue to plant, that they look at the sundial lupin instead. And then a number of host plants, columbines and milkweeds are host to specific insects, and marsh marigold as well. So there's a lot of different plants there that you could use for different environments in the landscape. If you're looking to buy native plants, one of the places that has a really good listing of them is the Wild Seed Project. So you can go to the Wild Seed Project website, and they have a place on their web pages that lists local sources to buy native plants. You can also buy seeds from them. They have a plant sale usually once or twice a year, and they can give you a lot of guidance on how to grow native plants from seed. Really neat and growing nonprofit in the state of Maine. I did want to mention some pest management resources. We have our Gut Pest website, which is sponsored by the Integrated Pest Management Council. It's very helpful in trying to figure out if an insect you have is a pest or a beneficial. And you can search based on where they are in the lawn, the trees and the flowers, the vegetables on you or your pets. Very powerful website and gives you a lot of ideas on how to manage. And then the sister site at the University of Maine Cooperative Extension is the Home and Garden IPM website. Again, I'll mention Doug Tallamy. One of his books now, he's basically promoting the Homegrown National Park. You can place your backyard as part of that if you want on his website. I've done that, and I recommend that you consider thinking about that yourself and reading his books. Nature's Best Hope is the one where he really starts this whole idea of 1 yard at a time to create a gigantic park that will help to bring back our insects, our birds, and the basis of all life. Bringing Nature Home is one that he wrote a few years back, which kind of got things started. I also recommend this book by E.O. Wilson about Half Earth. Basically, what his idea is that if we continue to plow up and build on more and more of the earth, once we get past the halfway point, then we're probably reaching a tipping point where eventually life is going to collapse. And we're already at that point. So we need to be doing everything we can to create newer habitats. And at the same time, we need to let farmers grow food as efficiently as possible, because it's the farming that is going to take over more and more land as the demand for food increases with the billions more that are going to be on this planet in the next 100 years. So I urge everyone to have a really wide open mind about all the different tools that are available to grow food efficiently, and to think more about the fact that if we go backwards, if we go just to organic, we're going to have to use so much more land, and that's going to get us beyond this half Earth point. Just keep that in mind. Try to have an open mind about that. I hope you'll pass on these ideas to your neighbors and to your loved ones, and that we can all, create more and more habitats in our yards. And if you're really interested in bees, I know that a lot of people are these days. I highly recommend that you get connected with our state apiarist that's on our plant health team here, Jen Lund. So if you're interested in a talk on bees, I'd highly recommend having Jen come talk to you. And with that, I am done. I think I've left a few minutes for questions, and I'm willing to stay even longer if people have questions.
Thank you so much, Gary. That was incredibly informative, and I think people learned a lot. So we do have a few questions here, and I think you may have answered a little bit of this with your resources, but this person, Valencia, is wondering, where can she obtain copies of an invasive plant list, keystone plant list, and pesticide list?
Okay, so the keystone plant list you can get from the Bringing Nature Home Doug Tallamy website. That's all available there. And or you can go to the National Wildlife Federation site that I showed earlier. And I will make this presentation available as a PDF that people can go to on our website. So I will make sure that you know about that, and you can pass that on to the people that are here today.
That sounds good.
So, those kinds of resources are available. In terms of lists of pesticides, that's very dependent upon the individual insect or disease that you're trying to control. There is no list of pesticides. You really have to figure out what you have, and then you can work together with someone like myself or the Board of Pesticides Control to find out what might be available to use for those specific pests.
Great. And on that same subject, this person is wondering, do you differentiate between pesticides and selective herbicides?
So herbicides are pesticides. They're all, the term pesticide is the general term for all the asides other than suicide and homicide, is the joke I usually tell. So insecticides, fungicides, herbicides, they're all pesticides. And there are selective pesticides and there are general pesticides. Ideally, you want to use something as selective as possible. And that's something that, again, based on the pest that you have, that's when you can make a choice in terms of, what you might use. I see that this person asked the list of toxicities of the organic pesticides. That comes from the Xerces Society. So if you do a Google search for Xerces Society and the relative risk of organic pesticides, I think you'll find that list.
Right. And now this person is wondering, I will be posting this recording on the library YouTube channel, but they're wondering if your slides will be available to view. They found them very informative.
Yes.
If
So what I will do is I will send a link to our website where this presentation will be posted in a PDF format. It's too big to send out to most people by email or something like that.
Great. All right. And this person is saying, I tried the no mow May and my dog was coming in with ticks from my yard. Any ideas for what to do?
So again, your dog, if it's going into the brush, that's where they're going to find the most ticks. In the spring, you're going to see more of the dog ticks that are in taller grass and things like that. Yes, that may create a little bit more habitat. What I recommend is that you have an area that's mowed for the dog, or if you want to utilize an area that you turn into a meadow, you just mow paths through it so you can walk through it and not wade through the tall grass. It can create some habitats that might be a little bit different, that you might create more tick habitat, but generally I think that can be managed. And I don't think it should be that big of a deterrent.
Mm-hmm. And Colleen is wondering, how do you safely manage ticks in your yard?
So unfortunately, tick management is something that is very difficult. And there are really good resources through the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station, as well as the University of Rhode Island. When it comes to actually spraying insecticides for managing ticks, they're not all that effective, especially if you go out beyond the areas that have been treated. And ideally, it's just perimeter treatments that are done, because that's where you're going to find the deer ticks, which actually can spread Lyme disease. Currently, dog ticks do not vector diseases in Maine. They do in other parts of the country, but not in Maine, and hopefully that won't change anytime soon. The other thing you can do, as I mentioned before, is to mow paths, so stay on the paths, or you can move play areas and things like that away from the edge of the woods, because where your deer ticks are right at the edge of the woods, where you have the transition from a mowed lawn or even a field to the shrubby, woody area.
All right, thank you. Kevin O'Malley asks, is there anything good to say about brown-tail moths?
So probably very little. Brown-tail moths are not native to Maine. And, they came in kind of at the same time as spongy moth, which is what we call gypsy moth now. They're very hairy caterpillars, so they're not taken up very readily by any birds or anything like that. They certainly end up getting eaten by something. So every organism that's out there has some purpose. Unfortunately for us, it causes a lot of damage to trees. And recently we've had a lot of drought, which has caused more stress on trees. So we've actually seen some trees starting to die just from 1 year of defoliation. And then the worst thing of all, of course, is that the urticaceous hairs that have a chemical in it that gets caught in our skin causes rashes and allergic reactions and things like that. So there's not a lot good that I can say about brown-tail moth.
Yeah. Sherry James says, we had a sunflower moth infestation last year on our coneflowers and black-eyed Susans. How can we control them?
So sunflower moth would actually be one of those things that's good for the birds. I know that it helps to kind of ruin the look of the coneflowers or black-eyed Susans. It'll probably be somewhat cyclical. It is not something that I would recommend you try to spray anything on, because it's not very easy to control. You might want to deadhead those as soon as you start to see the damage, and dispose of those flower tops as soon as you can. But otherwise, part of what I talked about today is that trying to tolerate a little bit of damage here and there is helpful for our wildlife habitat.
Yeah. All right. I think we have time for just a couple more questions. Jacqueline Saylor says that you mentioned at the start about a 2 to 3 year cycle for planting, but could you please go over that again?
So the 2 to 3 year cycle was about managing a meadow where you're mowing. So you don't want to mow every year, and ideally you mow very late in the fall, after all the birds have bred and moved, and you don't have a lot of impact from that mowing. And ideally, you would just do it every 2 years or every 3 years. And then you can add in additional plants as time goes on. An easy way to do that is to put a tarp out in one area and kill everything off just by leaving the tarp there for a year or two. And then you can go in and plant some native pollinator plants or something like that that will work well in a meadow type situation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, just 2 more questions here. One of them also on brown-tail moth caterpillars. What do we do with them? Should we put them in soapy water?
So if you are cutting the webs of brown-tail moth caterpillars, you can burn them. You don't necessarily need to put them into much of anything as long as you are double bagging them and sending them off to the trash. They're going to dry out and die this time of year. If the caterpillars themselves are what you're talking about after they've come out of the trees, you should, if they're like on the side of a house or something like that, or if it's the adult moths like I showed before, you can use soapy water to wash them off the side of a house and then use a HEPA vac to suck them up. You want to use a HEPA vac so that it has the filtration and you're not getting those hairs flying all around.
All right. And one more question here. Are there any birds that you would recommend we invite to our yard with nesting boxes?
Yeah, nesting boxes can be quite helpful as long as we don't put a whole lot of them all together and encourage diseases. You know, right now we're having lots of problems with the avian influenza. So it's a little touchy in terms of bringing a lot of birds together. Bluebird boxes, again, are still recommended. And sometimes the swallows will take those over. I don't think there's a whole lot of other ones other than if you can leave a big old dead snag in your yard, that's going to be good for woodpeckers that may then open up cavities for something like a chickadee or other cavity nesters. But you know, boxes I think are good if you have a few and you know that you might be able to attract that specific bird. But you need to have the right specifications when you build it in order to have the right size opening so that you don't end up with a parasitic bird like a cowbird or something like that in there.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you so much, Gary. Now, Jane or Lucy Ebert, do you have anything that you wanted to finish up with?
Yes, I'd just like to thank Gary for his incredible presentation. And I'd like to thank you, Julia, for hosting at the Camden Library. And if you are interested in joining the Camden Garden Club, please go to our website at camdengardenclub.org and hit the drop down that says join, and we can give you some information. So thank you to everyone for making this such a wonderful program again today.
Yes, thank you so much, Gary, for sharing this all with us.
You're
welcome. Thank you
welcome.
for the Garden Club for bringing it to us as well. All right, so have a good rest of your day, everyone.
You too. Bye.